Hi, everybody, and welcome back to our ShawLocal.com Bears Insider podcast. I am Hub Arkush from Shaw Media and 670 The Score and NBC Sports on television, as well as Pro Football Weekly back in the day. Our Chicago Bears beat reporter for ShawLocal.com is Sean Hammond, and Sean is alongside. And, of course, our Shaw Media Group sports editor, Kyle Nabors, here as well, as we have become the three amigos of this podcast. And we hope everybody enjoyed a little time off in the last few weeks. I'd like to tell you we were taking a summer break. We were just working on different things to get ready for camp. But we are actually visiting with you. I realize a podcast, you can listen to it whenever you want. But for those of you who are live with us on StreamYard, it's Tuesday evening, about 5:30, the first day of training camp throughout the NFL. And let's just start right there, Kyle. You know, a lot of unusual things this year as we try and bounce back from COVID. And this is the first time ever all 32 camps opening at the same time. All 32 NFL camps had reporting day today, players checking in, taking physicals. What they do at the camp from here on out is up to each individual team, but almost every team will be on the field on Wednesday for the first time. We know the Chicago Bears will be. And it's really kind of interesting to see it going this way. You talk about putting everybody on the same schedule with the same rules and the same starting line. That's what the NFL has done.
Yeah, it kind of snuck up on me. I don't know about you guys. Last year was such an odd year that you kind of throw it out the window, but I felt like we'd get more into a routine and be a little more comfortable this year, but it still kind of snuck up on me, Sean.
Yeah, no, it came quick. I mean, the summer it felt short between doing stuff in June with all the Justin Fields action going on and OTAs and all that, and it was nice to get a couple of weeks off, but ready to go here.
Well, the Chicago Bears say they're ready, guys. We're going to spend maybe 90 to 120 seconds on this, and then we're going to leave it alone because it's more interesting to the media than anybody else. But we do have a unique situation, and it's because of COVID, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Just with coverage and access and what we're bringing you these days, the NFL has issued a league mandate that no NFL team can have more than 25 members of the media with access to players and allowed indoor facilities and interviews. Outside watching practice, have as many media members as you want. But since there was no practice today, this was the first time that we in the Chicago media experienced some people getting shut out. I was one of the people who got in. Sean was one of the people who got shut out. As we go forward over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be there 98% of the time, but there is going to be various times when people who do this for a living are just like you fans and can't get anywhere near it. And, Sean, it's an unfortunate reality. I know, everybody's angry and frustrated and upset, including some of the teams, particularly here in Chicago. And one of the points that I have to make for everybody is the president of the Chicago chapter, the Pro Football Writers, talking to both sides, is that while we are in the third biggest market in the NFL, we've only got one team. New York has two, three if you want to throw in the Bills. Los Angeles has two. And so in terms of media contingent, the Chicago Bears media contingent is probably the biggest in the league, and it is going to challenge coverage a little bit, at least early on, until we sort this out and get it all figured out.
Yeah, you look at how many people were there for OTAs when Justin Fields, first got his first practices in, and there's far more than 25 people trying to get into these events. And unfortunately, I was one of the guys who was stuck watching the live stream with the rest of the fans. So it's a little bit disappointing. I can't ask any questions, but we'll just have to see how this goes moving forward.
Yeah, I got it, Sean. Kyle, I got to tell Sean, there's pros and cons. I know it's a little bit disappointing, but sometimes the live stream can work unless you have a burning question that somebody else doesn't ask. But this is going to be a source of controversy and topic of conversation throughout the year, Kyle. And I try and stay away from it because sometimes it just sounds like media whining, and I don't know if the fans really care. And some of it is just media whining, by the way. But in this case, it's a tough one because what's happening here, and this is the topic I want to get to and use this as a segue, Roger Goodell and the National Football League have decided that they're going to try and thread a needle here. COVID is still real. We all know that. The last thing that we want to do here on our podcast is get into any kind of political conversation or any vax or anti-vax conversation. I'm happy to do it if you guys want, but that's not what people are listening for. And our bosses don't love it when we say things that may not represent the position of the newspaper. So we're not going to go there. But the point that I would make is that we have discovered, at least we believe, there's no unanimous belief in anything when it comes to the law, but the strong consensus is that private employers can require their employees to get vaccinated if they want them to come to work. A lot are trying not to do that because it does open up all of these free choice and political conversations. A lot of the government agencies are starting to do it. The NFL would be wise to do it if they wanted to pretty much guarantee the success of their season, and they want to, but they're afraid to because they don't want another national anthem controversy that runs for a year or a year and a half or two and becomes the kind of political debate that they don't want to have. You can hear my dogs don't want to have it either, so forgive me for that. But, Kyle, what they're doing here is they've imposed these ridiculously strenuous penalties on teams should players become sick and unable to perform. If a team has an outbreak and is forced to forfeit a game, not only do they forfeit the game if they can't get it rescheduled, but the players lose a game check. And I tried to talk to some of the Bears about that today, and they don't want to get into it right now. But if it happens, and the first time it happens, it is going to open a controversy like nothing we've ever seen before.
I mean, you saw it right after that announcement broke. I think it was late last week. I mean, a player that's been very outspoken about not wanting to get vaccinated is Cole Beasley. But, so he immediately goes back onto Twitter. But you saw him getting into it with teammates. That's not what any NFL head coach, general manager wants to see is their players going at it about hot button topics on social media. If it's spilling out that far into the public sphere, what's happening within the locker room then. And I don't know how teams are going to handle it. You saw today that the Bears tried to walk that line of being positive about having a high vaccination rate, but while trying to steer that conversation away of not wanting to get into the topic of those players that may be hesitant or outright don't want it.
Well, and guys, this is actually the topic of my column for this evening and in tomorrow's papers. I don't want to give the whole thing away. But I kind of asked Allen Robinson the question specifically. He's one that's easy. We know what he's making because he got the franchise tag. He's going to make just under $18 million. These guys, they've actually changed it this year from 17 game checks to 34 game checks. They'll get paid every week during the season instead of biweekly, but it still works out the same. It's $1 million a game. If the Chicago Bears have an outbreak due to some unvaccinated players and are forced to try and reschedule a game, are unable to schedule that game, and it is canceled, they get an extra defeat, and the players are docked a game check. For Allen Robinson, that's $1 million, guys. That may be the biggest fine in sports history for an active player, although it won't be called a fine. And the question I put to A-Rob was, aren't you worried as teammates about this causing some potential strife if it happens? Can you imagine what a guy like Khalil Mack, who stands to lose a couple million, or Rob, or even minimum salary guys at $650,000, you're still talking about over $50,000. So this is a recipe for infighting and dissension and disaster. And I think that the league probably is aware of it, and they're hoping, I believe, Sean, that threat is enough to get a bunch more of these players vaccinated so that no team actually runs into this kind of penalty.
Yeah, that's absolutely the hope. And you hear teams talking about what a competitive advantage it is to have more players vaccinated, to have that rate higher and higher, 85%. That's the threshold that they're trying to get to. And it sounds like, we don't know for sure, but it sounds like the Bears are pretty optimistic that they're at that number right now. You bring up an interesting point. I'm not so much worried about the Allen Robinsons and Khalil Macks of the world, but yeah, if you're the 53rd man on the roster, losing a game check, that is a significant hit for those guys who are making the minimum.
Well, and the thing that's interesting, Kyle, and by the way, we're going to get to it again in a couple of minutes, and I'm not going to do too much because I do want people to go to shawlocal.com and read our reporting on this. But Ryan didn't really answer the question. He said, we like the way it's trending. We feel good about it. I think he's saying he expects to get to 85%. He certainly, I mean, based on what he said, we know they're probably not there, today. They had players still checking in as we were visiting with Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy. So they still weren't even positive who was and who wasn't vaccinated. But I can tell you with some certainty, at least as of Tuesday, they were not at 85%. The reason the league has picked that number, my understanding, is that it should help them get to herd immunity pretty quick. But as of yesterday, there were only 13 teams at 85%, and there were some teams that were still below 50%. But where this leaves a team, any team, it's not just the Bears, is even if you're at 85%, that still means that you've got, about 16, 17 unvaccinated players, and you don't know 3 of those guys could be your starting quarterback, your all-pro wide receiver, and your all-pro linebacker. And so, again, you come back to the same thing. If teams are forced to miss action and lose game checks because of the activities of a minority of players, I could see this becoming a disaster for certain teams around the league, Kyle.
Yeah, it definitely could cause internal strife. We talk about the bottom of the roster too. We're probably never going to know this, but I think it's really intriguing. Let's say I'm just throwing a name out there. Allen Robinson comes down with COVID, right? We find out he was unvaccinated, develops COVID. He's not getting cut for something like that. But if you're the 52nd, 53rd guy on the roster, you're at the bottom of that roster. You're trying to cling onto a roster spot, even if you're on like the practice squad, right? You get COVID and because you're unvaccinated. You would think that would kind of push those guys at least at the bottom of the roster, right, to get vaccinated, to make sure they're not one of those guys that has to worry about a roster spot.
You would think so. Hub's on dog watch here. How's the dogs doing out there, Hub?
My dogs are great. They're just making too much noise. I'm sorry about that, guys. Kyle, this question came up because now I'll give you the other side of that. Let's say that happens. Let's say you're down to 46 or 47. You've got 10 guys from which you can only pick 5. Yeah, because they're that close, you're probably going to lean towards the vaccinated player. But if you do, how many grievances are going to be filed with the NFL by the players who get cut? I mean, every way you look, they're opening themselves up to, somewhere between just a pain in the butt and actual liability. And by the way, I'm not taking a side here. I understand why they're doing it. If they do go out and say, hey, we've just decided this is it, everybody's got to get vaccinated. Well, we know, I don't know what the number is, but I think we'd all agree that it's somewhere between 25 and 35% of the population at this point is polarized so far to the right and anti, anything that the rest of the country wants, that the NFL risks angering 25 to 35% of his fan base, because the only thing we all have in common is everybody's a football fan, So I guarantee you that's the only reason that they're not forcing these players to get vaccinated, because they don't want a repeat of all the trouble they had when the national anthem became a controversy thanks to Colin Kaepernick.
Yeah, they definitely don't want to step in it. And I wonder, have you guys heard yet? So last year, if you signed someone off the street, right, or you brought someone into the building, a new player, didn't they have to isolate for 5 days before they were allowed in? So is that the same? Like, even if a player is vaccinated, like a street free agent, if they're vaccinated, do they have to wait 5 days?
Well, just so that we don't confuse people now, because we hear about 14 and 10-day quarantines. What the rule was, if he came in off the street, he had to test every day and be negative for 5 straight days. And so 5 straight negative tests, I guess, is considered as good as a quarantine. But yes, that was the rule, 5 days.
Okay. So, but were they allowed to practice it during those 5 days? They weren't allowed around their teammates or their new teammates, right? I don't believe so.
It's a good question. They couldn't be activated, but I think as long as they were getting daily negative tests, that they were able to be around there. And remember, last year everybody was wearing masks. Everybody was wearing the monitors, and being distanced. At least as we start the year now, if you're vaccinated, the media still has to wear masks in the building because we're considered guests. But players, staff, if they're vaccinated, they're not wearing masks right now. They're not wearing those monitors everywhere, and they're not getting tested every day. Any player who is not vaccinated is getting tested every day. They're not allowed to eat in the cafeteria. They can't sit with their teammates. They do have to wear masks in the building, all the things. They're trying to make it as uncomfortable as possible for the unvaccinated players for no other reason to convince them just get vaccinated.
Yeah, they're going to, I think you're going to see them continue to push their thumb down a little bit and just try and push people in that direction, at least as much as they can, without, as you said, really rankling some people in the public and worrying about grievances. They're going to do every little thing they can, though, to make life a little bit more miserable on those guys that are on the fence, just to get them pushed over, I think.
Guys, I will have more on this in all of our Shaw papers, the Daily Herald, the Paddock papers on Wednesday editions. You can also get it at shawlocal.com. I don't want the first day of training camp and what is supposed to be hopefully a return to normal to be all about the same stuff we were battling last year. So let's talk about a bit now about where the Bears are as they open camp. And, I think the biggest news of the day, it certainly wasn't shocking. We had hoped it would be the case. But even though I did not personally see him, he did not come to the media room. We were told by Roquan Smith that not only is Eddie Goldman in the building, but that he looks great. And both Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy, again, we were visiting them at noon as players were still reporting, and they said they honestly didn't have a list of everybody who had reported yet, but they expected Eddie. And I think Matt told us a week or two ago, and Ryan said today, that they had been in regular contact with him and seen him. They said he looks great. And Sean, nobody was happier than Roquan Smith, who's desperate to have both a healthy Akeem Hicks and Eddie Goldman in front of him. But that's great news for the Bears defense and all Bears fans if Eddie Goldman is back and ready to go.
Yeah, that's really good news. And especially that he's here, right from the get-go, no matter how much he's training, in the off season and in the last year or year and a half or whatever, you still don't know how he's going to react once he gets back into practice and gets going a little bit. So it might take him a few weeks to really get into that form of where he was before. And maybe that stretches on into the regular season. But the fact that he's here right today from the get-go, that's a really good sign.
Kyle, I'm going to let you just jump in anytime when we've got questions from anybody who's visiting with us. Let us know if we want to go to them. I know the funky boss just wants to say, thank gosh Goldman is back. And we can thank gosh, you can thank God, you can thank whoever you'd like to. I thank Eddie Goldman because I think it's fun to see him on a football field, and it's got to be good for the Bears defense. Don't know that this is major news, but I got an answer to a question I asked in our papers just the other day. Everybody is so focused on Justin Fields that I think they may be missing the more important question is who's going to play left tackle, because Justin Fields is not going to be the opening day starting quarterback, short of some unforeseen occurrence. And more than that, he's not going to get on the field until they're comfortable they can keep him healthy. And so while the whole offensive line is a question, the most interesting position I think is left tackle, because it appears that Tevin Jenkins, the 39th player in the draft, their second-round pick, is going to be a rookie plug-and-play starter. And by the way, have seen nothing through OTAs and minicamp to suggest he won't be. I'm excited about him. He's an interesting prospect. But rookie left tackles can struggle, and it's never been clear to me if there was another left tackle on the roster. So I asked Matt Nagy today, who is he competing with for that spot? Or if he gets it and is unable to go, who's your backup? And Matt said Elijah Wilkinson. And Matt then said, Wilkinson has some experience starting for other teams. What he didn't mention is I think all that experience is at right tackle. I know he's lined up at left tackle again, but as near as you can track these things with accuracy, I don't think he has any starts on the left side. He's primarily a right tackle and a guard. And so while they feel that they're deep on the offensive line, they have a lot of players that they like, they are playing with fire at left tackle. There's no certainty that either one of these guys, Tevin Jenkins or Elijah Wilkinson, is going to be an upgrade over Charles Leno.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Sean, but I really don't think that you should feel particularly comfortable with their depth. On the interior, yes, I think we talked about a lot in the offseason that we feel pretty good about the guard and center position. And I think all three of us really like Tevin Jenkins as a prospect long-term. But going into the 2021 season, if it takes a while for him to get going, I don't feel good about their depth outside.
Yeah, the depth is a little bit of a concern. If it's a situation where you kind of got to see it play out, and maybe Tevin Jenkins is going to be what they hope right away, and maybe it becomes a non-issue, after a couple of weeks once he gets his feet wet. But if he gets hurt, if it's not working out, then I'd have some real concern if I'm a Bears fan about, what's behind him on the depth chart and how they can, swing this without a whole lot of experience at one of your most important offensive line positions.
Well, Hub, I'll ask you this question. So we've talked a lot about, and we know that the Bears like to use their tight ends and for blocking, right? Cole Kmet was a better blocker, was a pretty good blocker as a rookie. They brought in Jesse James. I believe the signing became official today. Mm-hmm. A guy that's played in Pittsburgh. I believe he was in Detroit last year. One thing I don't know much about Jesse James is his blocking ability. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, he's a Y. He is a guy who theoretically can play in line or be a move tight end, or at least be a decent receiver. Probably not going to be a move tight end, and so I think probably a very solid number 3. That you could use him either way. He is not going to be the receiving threat. Certainly not that Jimmy Graham is, and probably not that Cole Kmet is. Actually, I can tell you he's not the receiving threat that Jake Butt is, the other veteran free agent that they brought in. The problem with Butt is that he's now had 3 operations on that ACL in his left knee. That's why he only played 8 games in 4 years in Denver. If he's healthy, I mean, if that knee is even 90 or 95%, I think then James is battling J.P. Holtz for the 4th tight end spot. But what this tells me is that with good cause, when you look at the unfortunate injury history that Bud has, the Bears are obviously not comfortable with the health of that knee, at least not now. They may have cause not to be, maybe they don't have cause, but they're just looking at reality. But I'll tell you what, if Bud can go and become close to the player he looked like he was going to be coming out of Michigan before he tore the ACL the 2nd time, and then he's torn it a 3rd time since. And then if Jesse James is your 4th tight end, if you carry 4, that's as good a tight end room as you're going to find in the league. But it's a huge if, Sean, to know if Butt can even make the team or do anything with where his knee is at. And certainly Jesse James by himself doesn't really offer more than a 3rd tight end. So it's another interesting veteran signing. I think it's an insurance policy. And it doesn't bode well for J.P. Holtz or Jesper Horsted. I love the fact that Scooter Harrington is an undrafted rookie free agent who's going to be in camp. I
love the name.
Well, I love the name, and he's out of Stanford, which has become tight end U, kind of like Penn State is linebacker U. But then you look at his numbers, he never played more than 5 games in a college season. I think he comes with about 20 college catches. I don't know the exact numbers. I don't know how a guy like that, and by the way, he played all 4 years in Stanford and didn't have those numbers. So, maybe he's just here because they love Scooter too. But we'll see. But if James and Butt turn out to be, solid additions, then they're really loaded at tight end.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of echo what Hub was saying there. I mean, it's really about padding the back of that tight end room, and you don't want to rely on a guy who's had 3 ACL injuries, and yes, maybe they're optimistic about what he could potentially provide, but I think it makes a lot of sense to go in and get another experienced veteran who's been on the field and has done it, and looks like he's been pretty healthy along the way.
Love Jake Butt, the player coming out of Michigan. Would really like to see him get healthy and have another chance in the NFL, because I thought he was going to be a quality tight end in the league. We've got a couple of questions coming in here, Hub, so I'm going to go ahead and throw this up on the board here and go through a couple of them here.
Well, CJ Williams just anticipated the next subject I was going for, so excellent segue. The other, I wouldn't call it big news because a lot of people expected it to happen sooner. But the Bears did consummate a trade on Sunday just prior to opening camp. Anthony Miller goes to the Houston Texans along with the Bears' 7th round pick for the 5th round pick from the Texans. That's noteworthy for a couple reasons. One is that the Bears have done very well in the 5th round under Ryan Pace, and we can rehash that at another time. But Bilal Nichols came in the 5th round. I believe Darnell Mooney came in the 5th round.
Jordan Howard
Jordan Howard came in the 5th round. There's another significant player on the defense who came in the fifth round.
Adrian Amos was a fifth rounder.
Right, yeah. So they've done very well in the fifth round. Now they've added another fifth round pick. And I really like Larry Borum, who they took this year, although we haven't seen what he can do yet. So you know, I think when I finished our 12-part series grading each group, I wrapped up the wide receiver group by saying, you know, that third spot is going to be a battle between either Marquise Goodwin and Damiere Byrd and Anthony Miller, unless the Bears can get somebody to give them a late round draft pick. And I didn't think they'd get a 5 to be. Now they did give up a 7 to get it, but let's be honest, what's the 7th round pick worth? Especially if they're in line for some more compensatory picks. We won't know that for a little while. Both Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy talked about it today, and Ryan made the point that even Miller wasn't surprised. He said that him and Matt had a really nice conversation with him to tell him about the trade. He thanked them for his time in Chicago, told them he hopes to make them proud of him and become a great player in Houston. You know, Miller is a kid with all the talent in the world, but it became pretty obvious he can't unlock, or at least hasn't unlocked, the mental side of the game. What's intriguing about it, though, guys, is that it's not like they were overcrowded with talent. They were just overcrowded with competition, because really once you get past Mooney and A-Rob, of course, one of the things you discover is if you look at the 7 years of Marquise Goodwin in the NFL and the 5 years of Damiere Byrd, yes, they are the 4th and 7th fastest 40-yard dash times in the history of the NFL Combine. The Bears have added speed like you've never seen. They're also both 5'9", barely 180 pounds, and neither one of them has had more than one productive year in their 7 and 5 years in the league, respectively. And even those productive years were just number 3 receiver numbers. So it's more about changing the type of players they have competing than necessarily saying that we've gotten that much deeper. Now they're talking, you know, about Daz Newsome. I thought it was interesting that they both mentioned Riley Ridley today, because I still have not been able to get my arms around why Ridley hasn't been able to get more playing time. And they even brought up Javon Wims again, but I still don't understand. If Anthony Miller is gone, I don't know what Javon Wims is doing here, but you know, he's here to compete. They're much faster in the wide receiver room. Darnell Mooney is likely to take another step forward, but are they really better, Kyle? I don't know.
Yeah, the funky boss over here on the side, just when you mentioned Mooney, asked, can we rely on Mooney to be a solid number 2? I think so. I know you're really high on him, Hub. I've come around. I mean, I was always thought he was solid, but I've come around on the upside. Outside of that, though, yeah, there are question marks. Goodwin, the injury history, don't know how much speed is left there. Damiere Byrd had one halfway good season in New England last year, but if you look at the Patriots roster, they're still starved for wide receivers. So if Damiere Byrd was anything special, I'm assuming Bill Belichick would have went ahead and scooped him up for another year. What is with Daz? Did they say he's good to go for camp, or where's he at in his recovery?
Well, they did. I shouldn't say the only move was Jesse James and Miller. They did put Tariq Cohn and Daz Newsome on the PUP list, the physically unable to perform list, to begin camp. But that doesn't mean a whole lot, because they can move him off that list and have him start practicing almost at will. They don't expect either one of them to start the season on the PUP list. They should both be ready to go. Sean, I can't remember now, or maybe they didn't even tell us, but I don't know if Newsome had surgery on that shoulder, or if they just set it to let the bone heal. Because the interesting thing about broken collarbones is that once you break it the first time, you're more likely to break it again. And once you have surgery on it, you're more likely to develop a chronic problem. I don't think I can't remember if he had surgery or not. Now I'm thinking maybe he did.
I'd have to look it up on our transcripts from June, but I remember somebody saying that he was going to have surgery. If that was Matt Nagy, I don't think Ryan Pace spoke during OTAs at all.
I think that they said he was going to have surgery, but we could all be wrong here.
Yeah, well, that's what originally I said. I don't think, and then as I was saying it, I'm remembering. I think he probably did. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You have surgery to heal it and make it better. The problem is that you become a bigger risk for future injuries once you've had that surgery. I know that they like Newsome a lot, but again, guys, I mean, he's I think a 6th round pick, wasn't he? Yeah, because Borum was in the 5th round, and so it's kind of the same story as Bird, and I have been determined to call Marquise Goodwin Marquise Grissom for the last 3 days, and I don't know why I keep doing that, but it is Marquise Goodwin, and I like Goodwin the best of the three. But even him, when you look at his stats, I mean, he's only had one full season, and in that full season, he had nice numbers, but nothing special. So I'd be more encouraged if they said, we think Riley Ridley is ready, than to start telling us, well, we got Daz Newsome, so we're in good shape. I hope they're right, but I mean, at this point, he's just a 6th-round draft pick who's never been on an NFL field.
I think the Anthony Miller trade might tell us more about how the Bears plan to operate their offense than how they actually feel about their wide receiver group. We've speculated a lot that the Bears were going to see Tariq Cohen used as a wide receiver quite a bit this season. We're going to see a lot of Cole Kmet and Jimmy Graham on the field together. So maybe wide receiver depth isn't as much of a challenge as it would be for some teams because of the way the Bears plan to execute their offense.
Well, here's what's interesting about that, Kyle. It's funny you go there because that is a question I specifically asked Matt Nagy today, and I tried to find a reasonable way to put it in saying, I know you added wide receivers, but when you look at their career records, we're not talking about guys who are proven quantities in the NFL, but what they are is, again, I just mentioned it, the 4th and 7th fastest players ever coming out of college in the 40-yard dash. So they've added a ton of speed, and they also did that with Damian Williams, significantly upgraded the speed at running back. You get Tariq Cohen back, who was one of the fastest players on your team. One of the things, the only negative on Darnell Mooney's great rookie year last year is that here comes a guy with 4.38 speed who only averaged 10 yards a catch. And so you ask yourself, you look at A-Rob's average per catch was down. Anthony Miller was at 9.9, 2.5 to 3 yards below his average his first 2 years with the team. And so you ask yourself, is that the wide receiver talent, or is that more of a comment on the way that Nick Foles and Mitch Trubisky played last year? And particularly, with Mitch, who became efficient, but a lot of that was dump offs and short stuff. And one of the things that Matt talked about for the second time this summer was one of the best things about Andy Dalton, who will be his starter, is his anticipatory throws. And we asked Allen Robinson, what are you talking about there with anticipatory throws? And he talked about how important it is, said every receiver wants that ball in the air and on its way when they come out of their break. And he said the reason is because if you're in man, you've created a little bit of separation at that point, or even if you're in zone, if you've got the ball immediately, you can find a seam in that zone and rack up yards after catch. And so I think what they're saying is that the combination of the speed and Andy Dalton at quarterback should bring that average per catch up quite a bit, because they also talked about the need to have more chunk plays this year.
Yeah, you think of, I don't know, when I think of Darnell Mooney's season last year, we rarely, we only saw him with some open space a couple of times. And actually the play where he hurt his ankle in week 17 is one of those that comes to mind. Like, they got to find ways to get these guys with speed out there where they can create a little space for themselves and show that speed. It's one thing to have it, but it's another thing to utilize it correctly.
Kyle, it's funny. If you go back to the draft in 2020, they took Darnell in the 5th round, and all they talked about was his speed and made it sound like they just went for the fastest guy left on the board because they knew they had to add speed, and all the focus was on that 4.3 plus 40 time. And yet you go back to the 16 games, as well as he played, and he was an epiphany of sorts for a 5th round pick. We as Sean just alluded to, we never really did see the effects of that speed, or at least I can't remember any time when he simply outran somebody or we saw him running 5-10 yards behind the secondary.
Yeah, I mean, how much of that was on Mitch? Their hesitancy to really push the ball down field with Mitch Trubisky at quarterback. With that being said, Andy Dalton was never quite a gunslinger, and he certainly hasn't been the last couple of years. You saw in Dallas, he was kind of your prototypical game manager. So I don't know how much more you can expect in terms of vertical game out of Darnell Mooney. I think they're going to try, but with the limitation that quarterback, at least to start the season, we're going to have to see how that evolves. But going back to the Tariq Cohen thing, I'll ask your guys' opinion. What is, to put you guys on the spot here, what is a number of targets you'd like to see for Tariq Cohen this season? Hub, go ahead and.
Well, you want to talk targets or touches? Because I don't know how much he's going to line up at receiver is part of the problem.
I expect him to line up more at receiver than running back. Maybe I'm wrong, but with the signing of Damian Williams, I expect them to try and get Tariq Cohen out in space on the edge a little more often than they have.
And Kyle, you could be absolutely right. I'm not arguing the point at all. I just keep looking at the body types and the traits of Marquise Goodwin and Damiere Byrd and Tariq Cohen. And if Tariq's going to be a receiver, you've got three of the same player, and you can have two of them on the field together. You're not going to have all three of them out there together. You don't want A-Rob off the field. You want Mooney on the field. So I think, even though the reason I love the Damian Williams signing is because now you've got a true number 2 back, and because both he and David Montgomery can be 3 or 4 down backs, I still believe Tariq Cohen's greatest value is as a true 3rd down back in the Darren Sproles mode. And so what that means to me is I'm sure they will line him up at receiver on occasion, but I'd like to see him in any 3rd and long situation lining up at running back. And sometimes that's going to mean he's going to run with it. Sometimes they're going to throw him to football. So I think with the ability that we've seen of his, I would like to see him get at least 10, 12 touches per game. And so if that's 4 or 5 punt returns and 3 or 4 carries out of the backfield and 5 receptions, I think that's the best way to get the most value out of him. Sean, maybe you have a different take on that.
No, I kind of agree with that. And I don't know that there's a number you can throw out for touches for him, but his targets did go up every single year in the passing game his first 3 seasons, before obviously last year he was out with the injury. I don't know, Kyle, did you like what they did with him in 2019? He had 104 targets in the passing game, 64 carries. What do you envision?
Yeah, I think 104 targets over 16 games. What are we looking at there? Trying to do math in my head. There's a reason. There's a reason we're journalists and not.
You're looking at 6.5 targets a game.
There you go. Thanks. Yeah, I think that's about a good. I was going to say somewhere between 5 to 7. So I think that's a good measure for Tariq Cohen. I'm going to go ahead, guys, and throw up another question on here from Rick Gonzalez that goes over to the defensive side. And go ahead, Hub. I'll let you read it off for us.
Rick wants to know who's under more pressure to perform this year, Eddie Jackson or Jaylon Johnson. I don't think, to be honest with you, Rick, I don't know that either one is under any great pressure. Eddie's got the big contract in his pocket now. So I think that, he's a pro. He's an all-pro or was, and I think that he personally wants to return to that level. I think that, he doesn't want to hear disappointment with his performance from fans and media and teammates and coaches. But in terms of pressure, we talk about this all the time. He's already gotten paid, and we don't know if that had any impact on his decreased production in the last year and a half. Jaylon Johnson, 2nd year of 2nd-round draft pick, starting cornerback, played very well, led the NFL in passes defended amongst rookie corners last year. The expectation is he'll be as good or better. I think there's probably more pressure on Jaylon Johnson to stay healthy than there is necessarily as to where he's going to be on the field. So if you're asking which one needs to have the bigger year for the Bears defense to get back to where we'd like it to be, like 2018, well, that's easy for me, Sean. I'm going to say Eddie Jackson, because he was a difference maker and a playmaker. We hope that Jaylon Johnson can be that. We know that Eddie Jackson can be that. And so if neither one gets there, I think we're going to be more disappointed in Jackson than Johnson.
And I think Eddie Jackson's the type of guy, just knowing his personality, given all that he's been questioned over the last year or so, I would be less worried about him. I feel like that, he will use that as motivation to get into, his best possible shape and be as prepared as he can for this season. I'd be less worried about that. And because we've seen him do it before. From that perspective, I'd say there's a little bit more pressure on Jaylon Johnson. And part of it, like you mentioned, Hub there alluded to, is the injury thing. If he injures his shoulder again, that's going to put the Bears in a really tough spot. And I know that's obviously not within his control all the time, but I think the cornerback position has more questions than the safety position, and especially if Jaylon Johnson gets injured.
Yeah, I think the biggest concern with Jalen Johnson, to be honest with you, is that much like Jake Butt's knee, he's already had 2 shoulder surgeries and a few other injuries that didn't require surgery. And that's why it was so worrisome and troublesome that when he did go down last year and missed the last 3 games in the playoffs, it was a shoulder injury. So, there certainly is tremendous pressure to prove that those shoulders can handle 17 games. But as far as his performance on the field, if anything, I was impressed. I think he's got a chance to be very, very good. And so his pressure, I think, Kyle, is going to be mostly self-imposed.
Yeah, Jalen Johnson, I played really well last year. He just has to stay on the field. I think Eddie Jackson is coming in with a chip on his shoulder. He's kind of alluded to it, that he's been listening to what people have said about him. We hear that kind of speak from players, and it doesn't always translate to them playing better on the field. Only time will tell with him. I think you should be a little concerned considering how poorly he played last year. But he was a hell of a player coming into that. I trailed off a little bit in 2019 or 2019. Losing track of what year it is at this point, guys. But we got a question here talking about cornerbacks from Chicago Sports Fan or Chi Sports Fan, asking about nickel corner, Thomas Graham or Duke Shelley. I expect Vildor outside, which I don't expect Vildor outside, at least not unless Trufant really falls off the map here. But I mean, I think all 3 of us really like Vildor, right? I think that's going to be your first look at Nickelback.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I like Vildor, but not as much as Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy do. And I'm not saying they're wrong. I think they may be right. I mean, remember when they drafted him last year? This kid out of Georgia Southern. He's not going to be scouted or known as much as other, FBS players. He came out of nowhere at the Senior Bowl, started flying up draft boards, and some people didn't think he'd make it to the 5th round. Another 5th round pick, by the way, the Bears have found. I think he's got a good chance of competing for the other starting cornerback spot. But I also know, because actually Ryan talked about him today, Ryan Pace talked about him on Tuesday at his opening presser, they still think that they've got something in Desmond Trufant. They think they know how to keep him healthier than he was last year. They talked about the fact that those were soft tissue injuries in Detroit, and they've been working on it all during the offseason. You also have to remember that Jalen Johnson wasn't given a start last year until Artie Burns tore his ACL the second week of training camp. Burns is a former first-round pick who they like a lot. And so for Vildor to end up outside, he's got to beat out both Trufant and Burns, both former first-round picks. And if he does, great. I think everybody will be happy. But I think the Bears would be happier if he became a dominant nickel, Vildor that is, and that if Trufant or Burns or both give them the boundary corners that they want, because then you're in pretty good shape. Duke Shelley hasn't been awful, but I don't think he's a lock to make this team either. I mean, he hasn't shown that much. He probably will make the team, Sean, but I think right now, if the opener were tomorrow, that Vildor would be the nickel. You'd probably have Trufant at the corner across from Johnson, and then Burns would be the first guy off the bench if it plays that way. But again, guys, they've been talking all summer, and a lot more today again, about how much better the competition is on this roster than it's been at any time they've been together in their 3 years. And that part I will agree with them on, because while cornerback is a big question right now, there's enough talent there in camp, Sean, that it could become one of the strongest positions on the roster.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Burns, Hub, because he's really the wild card in all this. I think because it's easy to forget that he's there after missing the whole year with injury. And was he out there for OTAs? I'm trying to think now if he was dressed
this year,
this spring. Yeah,
yes.
this year. Yes,
he didn't practice every day, but we did see
he was
him
in there some. Yeah, okay. Because we really don't know what they're going to have in him at this point, and maybe he can, if he gets back to where he was before. They were really high on him last year, so maybe they're looking at him as a guy who could be eating up one of those spots.
I think they like Artie Burns. The one name we haven't mentioned here is Trey Roberson, a kid out of ISU grad, played in the CFL. They gave him a decent chunk of change last spring. Ended up not seeing the field. I believe he was injured last year. Didn't he get hurt pretty early on?
Yeah, guys, I think he had an injury, but I think it was one of those that got worse as it went on so that they could justify having him on IR.
Yeah.
I think that they wanted to get a redshirt year out of him after he was very good in Canada. But yeah, he did miss the year last year due to injury.
Yeah, so you got Trey Roberson in there as well. To me, the first thing I think that comes up, as you said, is if it won't be Vildor, it's going to be Artie Burns. They're going to see what they have there. But I mean, if Vildor plays like he did in OTAs, they were really high on him. Everyone I think was impressed with the way he performed during OTAs. He could force himself into that conversation if Desmond Trufant underperforms.
Well, and the other thing to keep in mind, guys, Trufant has played some nickel, but he is primarily a boundary corner, and I don't think Burns has played it at all. And when you look at the body types on the three of them, Vildor is the best suited to be that inside slot corner. And so my guess is that he'll start the season as the strong front runner there. And then we'll see where they go after that. We are just about out of time here, guys. We're running long, and I have to apologize to our good friends at Heinz Lumber, our great sponsor of our podcast. They have 11 locations around Chicagoland for all your building needs. Are you considering an addition? Are you considering some rehab? Are you building a new house? Whatever it is, find the Heinz Lumber location closest to you and get out and visit with them because they are your best spot for all of your building needs. I'm not sure that there's really anything to put a wrap on it. We're going to be back every week now, and things are going to be changing from week to week. I don't know if all of our listeners realize that while the Bears will have 3 exhibition games this year, Matt Nagy did say specifically this morning, remember his first year here, none of the veterans played at all, basically. His plan last year was to get them playing a lot because it didn't work so well with them not playing. Then they were all canceled. He told us this morning that he is still going to lean towards being more aggressive with the exhibitions and to get more playing time out of them. He did say, without being specific, to expect to see quite a bit of Justin Fields in those exhibition games. And in addition to 3 exhibitions, the first one is against the Miami Dolphins at Soldier Field on Saturday, August 14th. But the Dolphins are actually coming to town on August 10th, and on the 10th and 11th they will practice with the Bears at Hallis Hall. So there is going to be, Sean, a lot more, not full go, but a lot more bumping, a lot more contact that way. It's always more competitive when you're playing another team besides your own, and so this is going to be the most physical and possibly most revealing and entertaining training camp that the Bears have had since Matt Nagy got here.
Yeah, you always like to see some competition. Those are going to be a couple of fun days, and we've seen in the past with plenty of teams around the league that sometimes those practices can get a little chippy.
Yeah, Kyle, it'll be interesting that it's the Dolphins because this is a team that's really on the rise, and we get to see Tua Tagovailoa, who was last year's version of Justin Fields. He's not the athlete that Justin is, doesn't have the arm that Justin does, was a better field general. And so, it'll be interesting to see them on the same field, be able to compare them a little bit. I think maybe where we'll wrap this is we've talked on and off about Andy Dalton, who will be the starting quarterback this year. And based on his first 10 years in the league, I have a very hard time getting excited about it. He is, on the other hand, been a good game manager. And as I wrote the other day, when surrounded by good talent, not necessarily great talent, he was 50-24 his first 5 years in the league. So with the firepower the Bears have added in their weapons, the offense should be better. Now, the question as to whether they can actually have a contending level offense is how good that offensive line is going to be, because the big difference here is that throughout those first 5 years that he was in Cincinnati, every year of which the team went to the playoffs, even though they lost all 5 of their first playoff games, his left tackle was All-Pro Andrew Whitworth. In the all but the first of his 5 seasons, his right guard was All-Pro Kevin Zeitler, and his right tackle all 5 years was the very solid, if not All-Pro, Andre Smith. This Bears line doesn't come close to comparing to that. So, really whether or not Andy Dalton can be the winning game manager here that he was in Cincinnati is going to go back to where we started. Is Tevin Jenkins the answer at left tackle? Are they really set inside? Is Jermaine Ifedi going to be okay at right tackle? And I really was impressed with Dalton being with him in person today, the first time we weren't on Zoom. He came in and really commanded the room, and there's not a lot of players that can do that in the media room at Hallis Hall. And so he got off to a good first day, at least in terms of how he's going to be viewed by the people reporting on him.
So what you're saying, Hub, is that offensive line coach Juan Castillo is going to earn his paycheck this year.
Juan, he earns his paycheck every year. If nothing else,
he's
just
got his work cut out for him.
Well, and as always, when we get into these things, Matt makes a point of referencing how accomplished and different Juan can be, and that's very true. And they have a long history, and that's why Matt brought him here. They spent a lot of time together back in the day in Philadelphia when Matt was first starting out in the coaching business. But it was Juan Castillo, Kyle, who told us about a month or two ago that he wouldn't be surprised if Jermaine Ifedi is an all-pro at right tackle this year.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. Hey, I hope he's right, but we shall see about that. The big question, guys, and it's not something that Justin Fields is dependent on so much as it's certainly going to impact his future, is how good are Tevin Jenkins and eventually Larry Borum going to be, because the hope is they're the bookend tackles of the future, and how quickly can they be ready to have you comfortable that Justin Fields is ready to go out there and play when the real bullets are flying.
Yeah, in the comments here, I haven't even put them up on the screen. We've had several asking about Justin Fields when he'll be ready to go. We're finally going to, I'm happy to just get into training camp and preseason here so we can actually start to get a better feel for when that answer actually might be, because I'm tired of just speculating. Oh, it could be week 3, it could be week 7, whatever it could be. I say pretty much no matter what, Andy Dalton starting week 1, but I think we're going to have a better idea of how long that could last by the time we get to, let's say, September 10th, I believe, maybe it's week 1, or September 12th, somewhere in that range. Yeah. A few days before that, we'll have a pretty good idea, I think, of knowing how long this is going to last.
All right, guys, we're going to put a wrap on this one, but it is an exciting time around the National Football League. It is by far the most popular sport in America, and it is back. We will now be back every week with our podcast. We want to thank you all so much for joining us this week. Again, our thanks to our great sponsor at Heinz Lumber. You've got 11 locations around Chicago for all your building needs. Most of all, though, we want to thank all of you for taking the time out to join us. For those of you who are with us live here on StreamYard, thank you for your questions and your input. And guys, make sure that you're getting to shawlocal.com at least maybe 10, 12 times a day, guys.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, well, we'll send you tweets and let you know when something special is going up, but we're going to have this Bears training camp covered for you from end to end like nobody else. And we appreciate you joining us today and letting us get it started. We'll be back with you again next week right here on our shawlocal.com Bears Insider podcast. Have a great week, everybody.